How are some industries mismanaging the future? What is the future of management education? What are some promising emerging technologies and the entrepreneurial opportunities that they suggest? Hello, I'm John Mooney. I'm the Associate Dean for Fully Employed Programs and Associate Professor of Information Systems at the Graziadio School of Business and Management at Pepperdine University, and this is the Graziadio Business Review. I'm here today with Dr. Charles Morrissey, who's been with the school now for a number of years and has spent over 50 years in either a role in business as a business professional or as a business educator. Chuck, thank you for being with us here today.
You're welcome. Thanks for the invitation, John.
So, Chuck, as you look back over your 50 years, a long career that's included roles in long-range planning at Fortune 500 firms, to at least 2 successful entrepreneurial ventures, a variety of others that maybe struggled along the way, and most recently in your roles as a business and management educator. What are the key themes that as you reflect back on your career that you'd like to share with our Graziadio Business Review readers?
Well, John, naturally, as you go through all these experiences and the educational process with lots of students, you try to develop some reflection on what were the attributes of successes and failures in your experience, and see if you can summarize them with some kind of theme to them. And it's one theme that I think I've finally homed in on is called managing what's next.
So what exactly do you mean, Chuck, by managing what's next?
This theme is an outgrowth of this overabundance of effort in strategic planning and in visionaries and extensive documentation on market futures that lay out for most firms and for most startups and for very successful firms a very detailed picture of what may happen in the next few years that they have to pay attention to and take action on. I think as you look at the failures, they misled themselves in the fact that they weren't really ready to manage what's next. And when what's next came along, they weren't ready. I think if you interviewed them before they get impacted by these substitutes or competitors, they felt very comfortable. And we have a long history of the companies such as Digital Equipment Corporation, absolute tragic failure, Polaroid, and a few others, including General Motors with its Saturn project. And when they got to that competitive position, they just weren't ready.
So you've talked about this notion of companies not being ready for the future, and more broadly this theme of companies that were not ready to manage what's next. So what are, in your mind, some of the attributes of firms that are not ready to manage for the future?
The commitment isn't there. They would disagree with you if you discussed it with them at the time, but the commitment required almost a complete independence of an organizational form. If you think about organizational forms that had to be created, they had to have independence. They had to have no vested interest. They had to have the commitment to the financial resources that are going to be required, and even to the point where they probably would be better off being relocated. This is a very difficult thing to talk about with managements. On the other hand, when you look at the firms that got there before them or shut down their opportunity, this is exactly what they did. They were called startups. So if you look at the history of Microsoft, Cisco, all of these firms that were allowed to overcome all the barriers to entry, they all had the characteristic of a standalone organization that had no other axe to grind and completely eliminated the chance for the firms that should have been in those fields to compete.
So I know there's a theme of creative destruction in the middle of all of this. What are your thoughts on this notion of creative destruction?
Well, it's healthy. I mean, you think about the health of Microsoft, Cisco, Dell, FedEx, and so forth. This is where the growth in this country comes from. And it comes from not seeing a vision others didn't see, but doing something about it. And in the postmortems, particularly in a Polaroid or a DEC or some of the other failures, even there, as they rationalize why they didn't capture those markets, one of the themes that comes through is that those weren't our real businesses. So in the case of Polaroid, that was not silver film. That was a different photographic technology. That's not us. And they were very apprehensive about moving forward. And Polaroid went and collapsed in almost 2 years from the height of their stock price.
Mm-hmm. So I just recalled a concept by another famous Irish American, Boston-born and raised, Jack Welch, and his notion of destroyerbusiness.com. Yes. So that fits with this theme?
That's a healthy mechanism if you do this kind of scenario planning, is to have your own management team create a competitor. And they're really good at it. And he found that the most valuable tool he had. They would come in and destroy his plastics business in 20 minutes, and he would say, well, why aren't we doing anything about it? And they'd look for the encouragement to move forward and to be there before someone walked in with a substitute. And that was a very effective technique for GE. But he let them do it.
Right. So GE is interesting in that it's got all of these divisions across multiple industries. Yes. Do you have a sense that there are particular industries right now that are more prone to mismanaging the future?
The one that's been most dramatic, and I think everyone's identified, is the newspaper industry. The newspaper industry was always confused, I think, about what business they were really in. They were proud of their reporters and so forth, but they're in the advertising business. And if you're talking about the fact that Google was the biggest threat they had, you probably wouldn't be asked out to lunch. So that the perception of what you do as a business has a lot to do with blinding you to forming some competitive tool to compete in the future if you don't see your industry in the right light.
So other than newspapers, any other industries you think that are under threat right now?
Well, in this environment, I'm sorry I have to say this, but higher education right now is facing a perfect storm. We're beginning to see the enormous impact of the recession on top of a lot of schools trying to identify how they can become more productive, for example. And one of the things that is emerging in some of these discussions is that perhaps undergraduate school should be 3 years instead of 4 years. To date, there's very little activity to make a move like that. And they could well become the next poster child for my managing what's next failure. This takes an enormous amount of restructuring, but if you look at the future of higher education, they have to be better and more economical.
So let's stick with higher education then.
Yes.
And I'm aware that you're an alum of the MBA program at Harvard Business School. Your PhD was with the Drucker School at Claremont. You've been a proponent of technology-supported learning for many years now. Most recently, I guess, your dissertation, your PhD dissertation specifically, was in the area of rethinking the virtual university, and you've published in that area as well. It's particularly in the communications of the Association for Information Systems. As you look at where we are today in business schools with respect to this broad area of technology-supported learning or e-learning, and looking back, because you've been involved in this industry, in this approach to business education for quite a while, what's your thoughts on where we are today relative to where you thought we might be, and what do you see as being the outlook over the next 15 to 20 years?
The business school environment is one in which they've had ample opportunity to take advantage of what I call anytime, anywhere. Just the technology we're using today is a good example of it. I think that for them to position themselves competitively, they're going to have to be able to deliver their content on a demand basis. And that means globally, it means enormous restructuring in terms of how they position themselves as a school. And this is coming faster than 15 or 20 years. I think sitting here 5 years from now, I think you'd find that a lot of profs are teaching in a lot of places but they're sitting in their home while they're doing it.
So do you think that that would also apply to the top tier universities like Harvard? Does that big campus at Harvard become obsolete?
No, the campuses, I think, will always be there. I think these programs will always have some residency feature to them, that people really want to go there. But a great deal of their work can be done before they go there, and a great deal of their work can be done after they're there. And this virtual university model is well understood, and it's way behind the curve.
So are there any exemplars of this at the moment in terms of universities or business schools that you think are properly managing the future of higher education?
The closest one I can identify is Cornell. Cornell right now has extended themselves from Ithaca, New York, all around the world. And I think if people are looking for an example of what I'm talking about, I'd look to Cornell.
So what about pure online programs? Where do they fit in this mix?
They're constantly struggling with their value in terms of the degree itself. The pioneers in that field were all for-profit institutions. And for-profit institutions in higher education, I think, suffer from a halo effect that because they're for-profit, they can't quite do the job. So I think they'll always have that problem. So that the nonprofits, the large universities, will always have to maintain, I think, that role that there is some face-to-face contact with the profs at some point. But they can't extend their resources everywhere.
So if I recall, you made some pretty bold predictions in 2002 about where we would be by 2010 with business education. And I don't think we've quite gotten there yet. So what's holding us back?
The traditional org structure in higher education, certainly, those roots run really deep. Until you have these external forces like a corporation has, with pricing issues, productivity issues, a word that doesn't really resonate in the higher ed environment, you're not really driven to take these steps. But they're a good example of not managing what's next.
So the other part of your career, Chuck, that you've spent many years in, and it's been a key theme of many of the activities that you've done, is in and around technology and in emerging technologies in particular. I recall that your very first business venture was timeshare, and a little historical artifact here, academic computing from timeshare. And timeshare's business model, as I understand it, was to sell access, so sell computing time to academic institutions, and really selling software applications as a service. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing today is one of the hottest topics in the world of IT today is software as a service.
Yes.
And there seems to be significant parallels between what timeshare did 40 years ago and what the IT world is abuzz with right now. So what is this? Is this back to the future, or what's going on?
The more things change, the more they stay the same. The whole concept of anytime, anywhere access to computing came out of the time-sharing development at Dartmouth and at MIT in the early 60s. And the opportunity to log on with a telephone, with a terminal, to a computer exploded. And by 1968, we had the internet development through DARPA, and it took a long while to commercialize the internet, but the basic concept is still there. It doesn't matter where the software is, you can have access to it, as you see today with even a handheld device. Same basic concept.
But something has changed, presumably, in the last 40 years.
Probably, well, the technology speeds, the printing speeds, all those did nothing more than enhance the opportunity to take advantage of these things. We're now into the stage where ebooks are being printed on demand when you go into a bookstore. All these things were foreseen, just waiting for speeds, printing speeds, and a venture that recognized the opportunity. And you'll notice the people that are taking advantage of this opportunity aren't the people you'd expect. Textbook publishers still consider, I think, the computer a good way to keep track of books. Mm-hmm. And they've missed the whole opportunity. Mm-hmm. And somebody's going to take it up from them, and you're going to see another industry in transition.
Another thought on how it's changed is, I'm assuming that timeshare by its name originally charged by time. Was that true by
Yeah.
minute, by
Each
connection time?
school, yes, sir. Each school had a dedicated line that was theirs to use as they felt fit. This is the kind of service that Bill Gates used, and hundreds of others his age, by the way. And the school managed it as a resource. And mostly high school math teachers took advantage of it, and in some cases, perhaps geography teachers. It was interesting who really saw the device as a resource that they could use to teach with. Ironically, very few colleges did it.
Why was that?
That was really a puzzle to us because we felt we had to move quickly from the K-12 world to universities. And I think it was a not invented here climate that as long as they had an IT group, they could do this themselves. But the K-12 world recognized this is a resource they could never develop on their own, and that's why we grew in the K-12 world.
So I'm also aware within this K-12 world, there's a number of now internet-based educational ventures, some of which actually are offering services for free.
Yes.
So how does that business model make sense?
You always look to someone who's your wonderful model of what should be, and I'd recommend to anyone to take a look at the Khan Academy. That's K-H-A-N Academy. He's done a magnificent job of providing tutorials in science and mathematics, K-12, on YouTube for free. And it's so well done that everybody staring at it would say, what a resource. And very few school systems use it.
So this whole area of web-based ventures, especially ones that give away products or services and particular services for free, makes me think about the viability of that venture in the long term.
Yes.
And I guess that's something that would be interesting to see how Khan is proposing to do that. But it also reminds me that another area that's been a significant passion of yours for many years, both as a practitioner and more recently as an academic, is the area of entrepreneurship. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, you've been involved in a number of entrepreneurial ventures, many of which have came to a successful completion, and I know you're still involved in a number of entrepreneurial ventures. You've also, for the Graziadio School, you were involved in the entrepreneurial activity of taking our executive MBA program up to the Bay Area, where it still is today, some 20 years later, almost, or thereabouts. And now you also, you've been instrumental in developing the, we're bringing in the entrepreneurial emphasis into the full-time MBA program and the fully employed MBA program. So as you look back over your roles as a practitioner and as an educator in entrepreneurship, what do you see, first of all, as sort of some of the themes around the future of entrepreneurship for the U.S. economy?
Well, it's always been the lifeblood of this country. Every company was a startup at one point. We tend to see big companies and startups, but they were all startups at one point. The most frightening part of the future of new ventures, I'm afraid, is funding. Since the early 60s, when the venture capital world really kicked off, and then subsequently some tax policies on stock options and so forth kicked in, we've enjoyed marvelous resources for startups. Angels, venture capital firms, corporate strategy programs like the Xerox Technology Venture Program just drove a lot of these firms to compete for dollars and to perform. What's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, these resources have all almost dried up. It's been very difficult for angels to have any incentive anymore to invest. There's no tax policy to support it, and certainly going through the credit crunch, a startup walking into a bank, even though they're a going concern, doesn't get much of an audience. So somehow or another, this country's got to recognize that someone in Washington has got to also recognize that we've got to do everything we can to support new ventures.
So if we bring together the theme of education we've talked about, and now entrepreneurship, and I'm just like your thoughts on, given your experiences, education for entrepreneurs.
Yes.
And of course, one of the long-term debates has been whether entrepreneurs are born or whether they can be educated or developed over time.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's a pretty fragile bunch, and they do need that hands-on classroom mentoring somehow to get them through the various pieces of the puzzle that they're trying to put together. In the Xerox Technology Venture Program, my whole role was to take the startup, including one of our great graduates, Howard Shaw of Dr. Meta, and sit with them to see what they're in for. That these are the things that they're going to have to do that they don't really want to do, particularly techies. Techies do not want to run a company. So you need that educational component at some phase, pre-start, post-start, to take you through how these things work and to take a look at sources of cash 2 or 3 years out, or how they're going to hire people, or are they doing everything that's legal? Many of them get right away into all kinds of legal issues in the early months. So there's a major component of this kind of hand-holding and education, and business schools have been the primary source of this.
As you reflect back, Chuck, on your long career in terms of some of the either the role models, we mentioned Jack Welch a while ago, and he may or may not be a role model for you, but some of the role models or the thought leaders or the writers that have influenced your thinking and have sort of contributed to your own, the sort of development of your own thinking about business and management. Who stands out in your mind?
Well, in terms of writing, Drucker's original Practice of Management still resonates. It's still a very powerful book. It still has the key message that most companies forget from time to time, and that is start with the customer. That planning should always start there and work backwards. The other extreme is, the other end of it is Herb Simon's the Shape of Automation, in which he recognized the impact of computing to augment product development, decision making, and have a real pure understanding of what IS really is. And the third one is Gebauer's book called Commitment. And if you think about what's managing what's next, it's commitment.
So what about the whole area of entrepreneurship right now and weaving together? I want to weave together the theme of entrepreneurship with some of the early comments about creative destruction and mismanaging the future. Why is it that entrepreneurial ventures are often the trigger for some of this creative destruction that we talked about?
Well, it's a perception that a new venture takes looking at an opportunity, such as we did with the opportunity in K-12 for educational software, that the resident firms or the current firms obviously could move on very quickly. So it's somewhat of a risk-taking mindset that's in the American blood and says, I can do this. I often call them juvenile delinquents because they don't understand risk. And I'm glad they don't, because that's what created some of the major firms today, created Henry Ford and all these other firms. We've forgotten that. But you've got to have this venturesome spirit if we're going to get anything done, and you have to have some support system around them, whether it be education or funding, to help them.
So it's interesting as I reflect upon some of the key competencies that you've said entrepreneurs need to have. So finance is clearly a resource that entrepreneurial ventures need to have. You mentioned that there are certain things that entrepreneurs need to know. Although your comment now about the naivety about risk might even suggest some things that entrepreneurs don't need to know.
No.
So let me ask you to develop that. What, from your mind, what are the critical things that an entrepreneur needs to know in order to walk into a venture or pursue a venture and have a reasonable chance of success?
I think it's basically developing a little quick path on what they'll do and how long they'll do it before they decide that it's not going to happen. And they get very productive very quickly. Many of them do it having left their job or not deciding they're not going to pursue another job. And those first 3 or 4 months are very crucial, because they can give up very quickly as other people talk them out of it. But for the most part, if you look at successful entrepreneurs, nobody can talk them out of it. Some of them have taken forever to get off the ground, 5 and 6 years in some cases. So it takes that dedication. I know I can do it, I'm going to do it. And some of them do it with great downside to their families. And there's a dark side to entrepreneurship when it fails. But they pretty much have to lay out that path early and see if they can garner as much as encouragement if they can, or some other source that they never thought about. Serendipity plays a big role here. And mentoring always helps. If they can pick up the phone and call someone once in a while and say, what do I do now?
So I know you do a lot of reading on scanning emerging technologies, and I know you do a lot of thinking about the business opportunities that may emerge from that. A lot of the readers of the Graziadio Business Review will be our students and our alumni, many of whom may be aspiring entrepreneurs. So in this theme of mentoring that you just mentioned,
yes,
and this taking the role of the mentor, what do you see as some of the areas that you would sort of guide people to be either evaluating the emerging technologies on, or what areas of business opportunities do you think could be very important over the coming decade?
Well, there are two parts here. One, I think corporate America is going to spin off some of the activities they got into they never should have gotten into. This is an opportunity to literally go to those firms and buy that going concern. That's a quick way to hit the ground running. The other end of it are this vision in regard to most likely some things from nanotechnology, but for the most part, the fact that you can now perhaps be a producer of what we're doing today, you can be perhaps a publisher in a new sense of publishing a prof, if you will, but not a book. A lot of it has to do with leveraging the media that they're all using and are familiar with. And that's where most of these apps come from. You think of the proliferation of apps on the iPhone, where did all these come from? And it's people simply observing a need and immediately moving into plugging that hole and having a product very quickly.
Great. Well, Chuck, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us and for being here with us today. It's been a great pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you, John.
Well, this again is John Mooney for the Graziadio Business Review. Thank you for being with us. For more information, check out gbr.pepperdine.edu. Thank you.